There exists a psychological phenomenon, so insidious, so perfectly camouflaged within the fabric of everyday existence, that its victims become its most passionate defenders. Stay with me, because the last insight we'll explore is the most powerful. It might just rewire the way you see your life and your choices forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, leave a like if this resonates with you, and share your thoughts in the comments. What you're about to discover could change the way you understand yourself, your habits, and your future. Let's begin this journey. Imagine this. You're trapped within a cognitive prison, so sophisticated that the bars are made of your own beliefs. Every morning, you wake up and reconstruct these barriers with your thoughts, your words, your unconscious assumptions about what's possible for someone like you. Picture the neurological betrayal happening inside a child's developing brain. Every synaptic pathway being carved by conversations laced with financial anxiety. Every neural network being programmed by the emotional residue of scarcity. This child doesn't just witness limitation, they neurologically encode it, cellular memory etching patterns of restriction so deep that by adulthood, these constraints feel as natural as breathing. But here's the psychological horror that will fracture your understanding of free will. This isn't random social dysfunction. This is a system of cognitive control, so elegantly designed that its victims experience their mental chains as personal choice, their programmed limitations as authentic self-awareness, their conditioned fears as intuitive wisdom. Consider this neurological paradox that haunts every poverty researcher. The human brain, capable of infinite adaptation and learning, somehow becomes crystallized around patterns of lack. Why does the same neural machinery that can master complex skills, solve intricate problems, and create revolutionary innovations become paralyzed when confronted with the simple concept of personal abundance? The answer lives in the shadow realm of unconscious programming, what Carl Jung would have called the collective unconscious of poverty, a shared psychic inheritance passed down through generations like genetic code. Except unlike DNA, these mental patterns can be rewritten. But first, they must be seen. Picture someone you know, perhaps someone brilliant, hard-working, morally upright, who seems magnetically drawn to financial struggle despite every logical reason they should thrive. Watch their micro-expressions when opportunities arise. Notice the subtle flinch, the unconscious recoil, the way their body language contracts when faced with possibilities that exceed their internal programming. This isn't character flaw, this is trauma response. This is the nervous system protecting them from a future their subconscious mind has been trained to perceive as dangerous. What if I revealed that the poor aren't kept poor through external oppression, but through a specific form of psychological permission? Permission to remain small. Permission to fear their own power. Permission to mistake self-limitation for humility. They become the architects of their own confinement, the guards of their own prison, the editors of their own restricted story. This invisible curriculum begins its deadly work before conscious thought even develops. It's transmitted through the electromagnetic field of parental anxiety, through the subtle vibrations of financial stress that permeate every family gathering, through the careful way dreams are deflated in the name of protecting children from disappointment. The child's mirror neurons, those specialized brain cells that allow us to internalize the emotional states of others, become saturated with limitation before they've even learned to walk. But the most haunting aspect of this psychological architecture isn't its reach, it's its invisibility. The poor aren't oppressed by external forces they can identify and rebel against. They're controlled by internal algorithms, so sophisticated that they experience their limitations as personality traits, their self-sabotage as moral choices, their acceptance of less as spiritual wisdom. Here lies the existential terror that keeps philosophers awake at night. How do you rebel against a prison guard who lives inside your own mind? How do you escape a cage constructed from your own thoughts? How do you fight an enemy that speaks with your own voice, thinks with your own logic, and justifies its control with your own values? Think about someone trapped in this psychological labyrinth. Watch how they speak about money with subtle reverence and fear, as if it were a wild animal that might attack if approached too boldly. Notice how they find infinite reasons why opportunities won't work for them specifically, despite working for others. Observe how they've become connoisseurs of their own limitations, experts in the precise ways they're different from those who succeed. This isn't intellectual limitation, this is emotional programming, so complete that it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. They've been neurologically conditioned to feel physical discomfort when contemplating expansion, to experience guilt when imagining abundance, to feel like imposters when stepping into power. The most chilling realization is this: most people living within these mental boundaries will defend them with religious fervor. They'll argue that their caution is wisdom, that their small dreams are realistic, that their self-imposed restrictions are evidence of good character. They've become the willing guardians of their own psychological imprisonment, the passionate defenders of their own diminishment. But what if everything you've been taught about why people remain trapped is not just wrong, but psychologically inverted? What if the very beliefs that feel like protection are actually the mechanisms of your imprisonment? What if the voice in your head that whispers "be realistic" isn't wisdom, but the internalized fear of generations who never learned to fly? What you're about to discover could change the way you understand yourself, your habits, and your future. Let's begin this journey into the shadows of the mind, where the real battle for freedom is fought and won. To understand how deeply this psychological imprisonment runs, we must descend into the archetypal depths that Carl Jung warned us about, the place where individual trauma becomes collective mythology, where personal limitation transforms into cultural law. Consider what Friedrich Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the slave morality, not the obvious chains of physical bondage, but the far more insidious psychological shackles that convince people to worship their own weakness, to find nobility in their suffering, to mistake submission for virtue. This is the philosophical foundation upon which modern poverty consciousness is built. The belief that to want more is to be spiritually corrupt, that to strive for abundance is to betray one's authentic self. But Jung took this understanding even deeper. He revealed that within the collective unconscious, that shared psychic substrate from which all human experience emerges, certain archetypal patterns become so embedded that they feel like universal truths rather than learned limitations. The wounded child archetype, when activated in poverty consciousness, doesn't just create individual trauma, it creates a transgenerational transmission of psychological DNA that programs each new generation to expect less, deserve less, and achieve less. Watch how this manifests in the neurological architecture of decision-making. When someone raised in scarcity encounters an opportunity for expansion, their amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm system, triggers a threat response as intense as if they were facing physical danger. Their nervous system, having been conditioned to associate financial growth with family betrayal, social rejection, or moral compromise, floods their consciousness with anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt. This is what Arthur Schopenhauer understood when he wrote about the will to live being trapped by representation, the way our direct experience of reality becomes filtered through conceptual prisons that distort our perception of what's possible. For those raised in poverty consciousness, money isn't just currency. It becomes a loaded symbol carrying the emotional residue of every family argument about bills, every dream deferred due to practical concerns, every moment when financial limitation was used to explain away unfulfilled potential. Viktor Frankl, writing from the psychological laboratories of concentration camps, discovered something that should terrify anyone interested in human freedom. People can become so psychologically adapted to limitation that they begin to resist liberation. He observed prisoners who, when offered freedom, would sabotage their own escape attempts because the familiar hell had become more psychologically comfortable than the unknown possibilities of freedom. This same mechanism operates in poverty consciousness. The mind, having spent decades perfecting strategies for survival within limitation, begins to experience expansion as existential threat. The person doesn't just fear failure, they fear success. They don't just doubt their capabilities. They doubt their right to have capabilities. They don't just question opportunities. They question their worthiness to receive opportunities. Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith reveals another layer of this psychological architecture. Bad faith isn't lying to others. It's the more subtle process of lying to oneself about one's own freedom and responsibility. In poverty consciousness, bad faith manifests as the unconscious decision to remain powerless in order to avoid the anxiety of choice, the burden of responsibility, the terror of discovering one's actual potential. The person trapped in this existential bad faith will create elaborate philosophical justifications for their limitations. They'll speak eloquently about the corrupting influence of wealth, the virtue of simple living, the spiritual danger of ambition. But beneath these intellectual constructions lies a more primitive truth. They're terrified of discovering who they might become if they stepped outside the psychological boundaries that have defined them since childhood. Aldous Huxley warned us about this in Brave New World. Not the obvious dystopia of external control, but the more sophisticated horror of psychological conditioning so complete that people police themselves. In modern poverty consciousness, there are no external guards preventing financial growth. There are only internal algorithms programmed to trigger self-sabotage whenever expansion becomes possible. This psychological programming operates through what cognitive scientists call confirmation bias, the mind's tendency to notice evidence that supports existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory information. Someone trapped in poverty consciousness will unconsciously notice every story of financial failure, every example of wealth leading to corruption, every reason why opportunities won't work for them specifically. Meanwhile, their cognitive filters will render nearly invisible the countless examples of ethical wealth creation, sustainable prosperity, and successful transitions from limitation to abundance. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of this psychological architecture is how it disguises itself as wisdom. The voice that whispers, "Don't get your hopes up," feels like practical intelligence. The impulse to reject opportunities feels like moral integrity. The tendency to find flaws in every path toward expansion feels like sophisticated critical thinking. This is the existential trap that keeps millions of brilliant, capable, morally upright people locked in cycles of financial limitation. They've been programmed to experience their own power as danger, their own potential as threat, their own freedom as betrayal. The question that should haunt every person who recognizes these patterns within themselves is this: if your limitations feel so natural, so reasonable, so morally justified, how can you tell the difference between authentic wisdom and internalized oppression? How do you distinguish between genuine humility and programmed self-diminishment? The psychological tentacles of poverty consciousness don't merely restrict financial growth, they infiltrate every dimension of human experience, creating a cascade of invisible consequences that reshape reality itself. What emerges is not just individual limitation, but a collective hallucination so pervasive that entire communities begin to mistake their shared imprisonment for natural law. Consider the neuroplasticity research that reveals how repeated thought patterns literally sculpt the physical architecture of the brain. When someone spends decades reinforcing neural pathways associated with scarcity, limitation, and self-doubt, they're not just thinking poor, they're becoming neurologically poor. Their brain begins to optimize for survival rather than growth, for defense rather than creation, for maintaining the familiar rather than exploring the possible. This neurological transformation manifests in what researchers call learned helplessness generalization, where the sense of powerlessness in one domain begins to contaminate all other areas of life. The person who believes they can't escape financial limitation gradually begins to believe they can't escape any limitation. Their relationships become exercises in mutual diminishment. Their career choices become exercises in settling. Their dreams become exercises in self-betrayal. But the most insidious consequence operates through what psychologists term identity foreclosure, the premature closure of identity development that occurs when someone accepts a limited self-concept as final truth. Instead of viewing themselves as beings in constant evolution, they begin to experience their current limitations as permanent character traits. "I'm just not good with money" becomes not a temporary skill gap, but an unchangeable aspect of personality. Watch how this identity foreclosure creates a psychological immune system against growth. When opportunities arise that conflict with their established self-concept, the mind doesn't process these as possibilities, it processes them as threats to psychological coherence. The threat response isn't just emotional, it's existential. To accept the opportunity would require them to admit that their entire self-understanding has been false, that they've been living beneath their potential, that they've been complicit in their own diminishment. This is why people trapped in poverty consciousness often experience more anxiety when things go well than when they go badly. Success creates cognitive dissonance. the uncomfortable mental state that occurs when reality contradicts deeply held beliefs. Their nervous system, having been calibrated for struggle, interprets peace as danger, abundance as instability, growth as loss of identity. The sociological consequences ripple outward like psychological contagion. Communities trapped in collective poverty consciousness develop what anthropologists call crab bucket mentality, the tendency to pull down anyone who attempts to rise above the group's shared limitations. This isn't malicious. It's a misguided attempt to maintain psychological cohesion by ensuring everyone remains at the same level of limitation. Children growing up in these environments absorb not just individual trauma, but systemic hopelessness. They witness adults who've given up on expansion, who've made peace with limitation, who've found identity in struggle. The child's mirror neurons, those specialized brain cells that allow us to unconsciously absorb the emotional states of others, become saturated with resignation before they've even learned to hope. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is the way poverty consciousness distorts the perception of time itself. Instead of experiencing time as a medium for growth and creation, it becomes a prison of repetition. The future isn't seen as a space of infinite possibility, but as an extension of current limitation. Dreams aren't blueprints for creation, but dangerous fantasies that must be abandoned in favor of realistic expectations. This temporal distortion creates what psychologists call present bias, the tendency to overvalue immediate concerns while undervaluing future possibilities. Investment becomes psychologically impossible because the future self feels like a stranger. Long-term planning becomes emotionally unavailable because the future feels predetermined by current circumstances. The cultural consequences manifest in languages of limitation that become self-fulfilling prophecies. Phrases like, "Money doesn't grow on trees," "We can't afford that," and "people like us don't do things like that," become incantations that reshape reality through repetition. Each utterance reinforces neural pathways of impossibility. Each repetition deepens the psychological grooves of limitation. Watch how this linguistic programming creates what linguists call reality bubbles, shared conceptual frameworks that determine what seems possible, reasonable, or moral within a particular community. Inside the poverty consciousness reality bubble, financial struggle feels noble, ambition feels dangerous, and settling feels wise. The bubble becomes so complete that alternative realities become literally unimaginable. The most haunting aspect of these unseen consequences is their invisibility to those experiencing them. The person trapped within these patterns doesn't experience themselves as limited. They experience themselves as realistic. They don't feel psychologically imprisoned. They feel sensibly cautious. They don't recognize their self-sabotage. They see prudent decision-making. This creates what philosophers call false consciousness, a state where people's subjective experience of their situation prevents them from recognizing their objective circumstances. They become unconsciously complicit in their own limitation, passionate defenders of their own diminishment, willing guards of their own prison. The question that should shatter every comfortable assumption is this: how many of your most rational, well-considered decisions are actually the unconscious execution of someone else's programming? How much of what you call wisdom is actually internalized fear? How many of your limitations are choices, and how many are psychological compulsions disguised as choices? But here's where the story takes a revolutionary turn, where victims become victors, where the programmed become the programmers of their own reality, where the psychologically enslaved discover they've always held the keys to their own liberation. The first act of rebellion isn't external, it's neurological. It begins with what neuroscientists call metacognition, the capacity to observe your own thinking patterns as if you were watching someone else's mind operate. When you begin to notice the voice that automatically says, "I can't afford that," before you've even calculated the cost, when you catch yourself dismissing opportunities before you've examined them, when you observe your nervous system contracting in the presence of abundance, you're beginning to separate your authentic self from your inherited programming. This metacognitive awakening is what the philosopher René Descartes was reaching toward when he declared, "I think, therefore I am," not the thoughts themselves, but the consciousness that observes the thoughts. The rebellion begins when you realize that the voice telling you to stay small isn't your voice at all. It's an echo chamber of generational fear, disguised as personal wisdom. Consider how the great psychological revolutionaries broke free from their inherited limitations. Viktor Frankl, surrounded by the ultimate expression of systematic dehumanization, discovered that even in concentration camps, there remained one inviolable freedom: the freedom to choose one's response to any situation. His rebellion wasn't physical escape, it was the psychological recognition that external circumstances could never determine internal reality unless he gave them permission. Carl Jung rebelled against his own psychological inheritance by developing what he called individuation, the conscious process of differentiating oneself from the collective unconscious. He understood that true freedom required not just rejecting external authority, but recognizing and transcending the internal authority of inherited beliefs, familial patterns, and cultural programming. The practical rebellion begins with what researchers call cognitive restructuring, the systematic process of identifying and challenging the automatic thought patterns that maintain limitation. When the voice whispers, "Money is the root of all evil," the rebellious mind asks, "According to whom? Based on what evidence? What would I believe if I had never heard this phrase?" This isn't positive thinking, it's forensic psychology. You become the detective investigating your own mental crime scene, uncovering the fingerprints of everyone who contributed to your current belief system. You begin to distinguish between thoughts that serve your expansion and thoughts that serve your limitation. You start to recognize the difference between intuitive wisdom and internalized oppression. The neurological rebellion continues through what scientists call experiential neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself through new experiences. When someone raised in scarcity consciousness deliberately exposes themselves to environments of abundance, their neural networks begin to develop new pathways. Their nervous system starts to calibrate for possibility rather than limitation, for growth rather than survival. But the most radical aspect of this rebellion is the recognition that poverty consciousness serves a hidden psychological function. It protects the ego from the terror of unlimited responsibility. As long as you believe you're powerless, you're also blameless. As long as you accept limitation as permanent, you're relieved of the anxiety of choice. As long as you remain small, you avoid the existential burden of discovering your actual potential. This is why breaking free requires what Soren Kierkegaard called the leap of faith, not faith in external salvation, but faith in your own capacity to transcend inherited programming. It's the terrifying and exhilarating recognition that you are responsible not just for your reactions to life, but for the very lens through which you perceive what's possible. The rebellion manifests through strategic identity reconstruction. Instead of accepting inherited labels like, "I'm just not good with money," you begin to experiment with empowering narratives. "I'm learning to master money." Instead of reinforcing limiting beliefs through repetitive language, you begin to speak new realities into existence through conscious choice of words. Historical examples illuminate this path. Andrew Carnegie, born into grinding poverty in Scotland, didn't just change his circumstances, he revolutionized his entire relationship with possibility. His rebellion wasn't against external oppressors, but against the internal voices that insisted people like him were destined for limitation. He understood that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about expanding one's capacity to imagine and create value. Oprah Winfrey's rebellion against inherited trauma and limitation became a masterclass in psychological transformation. She recognized that her childhood experiences of abuse and poverty had programmed her for survival, but that survival programming was inadequate for the life she was called to create. Her transformation required not just changing external circumstances, but fundamentally rewiring her relationship with power, possibility, and self-worth. The cognitive rebellion reaches its peak when you realize that every limitation you've accepted as unchangeable truth is actually a hypothesis that can be tested. When you begin to conduct experiments with your own potential, when you start to gather evidence that contradicts your inherited beliefs about what's possible, when you discover that the cage you've lived in was never actually locked, this is when rebellion becomes revolution. The question that ignites this internal revolution is devastatingly simple. What would you attempt if you knew that failure was impossible? Not because external circumstances guaranteed success, but because you recognized that every outcome, whether conventional success or valuable learning, expands your capacity for future creation. But this rebellion isn't complete until you understand the final truth, the one that transforms personal liberation into something far more significant. Here lies the truth that shatters every comfortable illusion about limitation, success, and the very nature of human potential. A revelation so profound that once you truly comprehend it, you can never again mistake your programming for your identity, your conditioning for your destiny, your inherited fears for authentic wisdom. The ultimate truth is this: your poverty consciousness was never about money. It was about power. Not power over others, but the terrifying, magnificent power to consciously create your own reality through the sovereignty of your own mind. Every system of control throughout history has understood this fundamental principle. To control a population, you must first convince them that their internal experience of limitation is external reality. You must make them believe that their cages are the world, that their programming is their personality, that their inherited restrictions are unchangeable laws of nature. The deepest rebellion isn't against poverty, it's against the psychological architecture that makes voluntary limitation feel like wisdom, that makes self-diminishment feel like virtue, that makes the surrender of personal power feel like spiritual enlightenment. The system doesn't need external guards when it has successfully convinced you to guard yourself. But here's the revelation that changes everything. The moment you recognize that your limitations are choices, not conscious choices, but choices nonetheless, you simultaneously discover that your power to choose differently has always existed, waiting for your recognition like a sleeping giant in the depths of your consciousness. This isn't metaphysical mysticism. It's neurological fact. Every thought you think creates neural pathways. Every belief you reinforce strengthens specific brain networks. Every emotional pattern you repeat becomes more automatically accessible. You are literally sculpting your own reality through the microscopic choices of attention, interpretation, and response that you make thousands of times each day. The poverty consciousness understands this truth, but inverts it. Instead of using this neuroplasticity to expand possibility, it uses it to reinforce limitation. Instead of choosing thoughts that serve growth, it chooses thoughts that maintain familiar restriction. Instead of exercising the power to reprogram inherited patterns, it exercises the power to perpetuate them. Consider the staggering implications. Every person who remains trapped in limitation is unconsciously demonstrating their power to choose limitation. Every individual who breaks free is consciously demonstrating their power to choose expansion. The capacity for choice, the fundamental freedom to direct consciousness, remains constant. Only the direction changes. This is why external circumstances, while influential, can never be the ultimate determinant of your internal reality. Viktor Frankl proved this in concentration camps. Nelson Mandela proved this in prison. Countless individuals throughout history have proven this by transforming limitation into liberation through the conscious choice to interpret experience differently. But the most revolutionary aspect of this truth is what it reveals about responsibility. You are not responsible for your inherited programming that was chosen by others, imposed upon you before you had the capacity for conscious choice. But you are absolutely responsible for what you do with that programming once you become aware of it. This responsibility isn't a burden, it's the recognition of your own creative power. When you truly understand that your thoughts create your reality, that your beliefs shape your possibilities, that your interpretations determine your experience, you realize you've been wielding godlike creative power unconsciously. The question becomes, what will you consciously create now that you know? The ultimate poverty isn't financial. It's the poverty of imagination, the limitation of vision, the restriction of possibility. And the ultimate wealth isn't monetary. It's the wealth of consciousness, the abundance of potential, the infinite expansion of what you believe is possible for your life. This is why breaking free from poverty consciousness is never just personal, it's transgenerational. When you refuse to accept inherited limitation as permanent truth, you're not just liberating yourself, you're breaking a chain that was forged generations ago. You're modeling a new reality for everyone who witnesses your transformation. You're proving that the impossible is simply the untried. The children who watch you break free won't just inherit money, They'll inherit the neurological understanding that limitation is optional, that programming can be rewritten, that the human capacity for transformation is unlimited. They'll grow up in the electromagnetic field of possibility rather than restriction, abundance rather than scarcity, conscious creation rather than unconscious repetition. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this ultimate truth is what it reveals about your purpose. You weren't born to perpetuate limitation. You were born to transcend it. You weren't designed to maintain the status quo. You were designed to evolve beyond it. You weren't created to accept what is. You were created to imagine and manifest what could be. Your rebellion against inherited limitation isn't selfish. It's an act of service to the future. Your refusal to accept financial restriction isn't greedy. It's a demonstration of human potential. Your insistence on expanding beyond the boundaries you inherited isn't arrogant. It's the fulfillment of your deepest purpose as a conscious being capable of infinite growth. The question that will define the rest of your life is this. Now that you know that your limitations were learned, that your programming can be rewritten, that your power to choose your reality has always existed, what reality will you choose? Your answer to this question isn't just personal, it's evolutionary. It's your contribution to the expansion of human consciousness, your gift to the generations that will inherit the reality you help create through your choices. The cage was always unlocked. The question is, will you step out?